So that's some stuff about me. Right now I'm a director of penetration testing for a company called Nuix. My background is sysadmin and testing, and I've been doing a lot of incident response and training lately as well. Done some book stuff and contributed to some open source projects as well. What we're really here to do is let's try that again. The monitor just blipped. Let's try this again. We're going to be talking about pen testing and specifically pen testing your incident response program. One of the challenges with pen testing is it means lots of things to lots of different people. I think for the purposes of today, what we're going to be talking about is pen testing as a manual process. A lot of people are saying, okay, so pen testing is a vulnerability scan with something else. And so one of the challenges I think with pen testing is when you're dealing with skilled people and you're dealing with a highly manual process, you should really never hear things like, well, I'm waiting on the scan to get started so I can start pen testing. And so if you ever do, really watching people do that process is kind of indistinguishable from navel gazing. So you probably want to find somebody different to be doing your pen testing. One of the biggest challenges for what we do for pen testing in general, let alone pen testing your incident response program, is the preconceived notions that people have. There's a lot of reasons that people don't want to get a pen test. And what's really interesting is the market is kind of changing for pen tests right now. A lot of people are sort of going with a more commoditized service instead of very highly customized testing for individual locations. And so some of the other challenges are people sort of assume the worst. And so they don't necessarily get what they really need because they just assume that, well, we're going to fail this thing anyway. And then the other one is, if you're actually buying pen tests now, it's hard to sort through the industry jargon about what you're actually getting. And so that's, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges right now is so many people mean so many different things when they say pen testing, it's hard. And then the other one is when you actually start talking about things like pen testing, a security program and incident response, and just dealing with the red team, blue team side, there's some real disconnects there. And what we're going to be talking about today is how to bring them together. And I think one of the interesting things is fear is one of the hardest parts about pen testing. People are kind of scared to let the pen testers into their organization. Some of them may think that it's like a bull in a china shop, or just sort of the inner Eeyore takes over. And these are actual real Eeyore quotes, by the way, but I think they're all appropriate. And so not being able to get business justification, I wish I could say yes, but I can't. So many people have gotten the same pen test findings year after year. There's just like, well, it's just going to be bad anyway, so why bother? Those sort of things. And so people already, yes, sir?
If they're getting the same results year after year, why are they bothering to do the pen test if they're not addressing what they're finding?
So that's a great question. The question was, if they're seeing the same results year after year, why are they bothering getting a pen test? And one of the biggest challenges in the pen test industry is the difference between strategic findings and tactical findings. One of the things you see a lot is people give you a list of all of the different systems that are broken in a specific way. They'll give those to ops. Ops says, we fixed all these. Next year, there's a whole nother set that's broken in that same way. So the problem is they're not getting the information they need to be able to strategically fix these. So it's not, I'm fixing this box, this box, this box. It's, we're fixing this throughout the organization. And I think that that's one of the bigger challenges right now as well is a lot of the people that are being cranked through security programs are very much tactically oriented because they've never done operations. Once you start doing operations, you understand how that works. You know, okay, so this is how stuff needs to be integrated into business processes. This is how all of this needs to come together in order to be able to help actually build up the information security program, not fix this box, and this box. So, one of the things I wanted to focus on is sort of the difference between sort of the type of pen testing where people are just getting those tactical and the strategic ones. And so let's focus on some of the reasons that people think about getting pen testing. Compliance is probably the biggest one. One of my favorites is, we'll say it, validating concerns. Because really, if you have a situation where security department is saying, we need to do this, and everybody is like, no, we're fine, we're good. So having a third-party consultant come in and find those same sort of things gives you external validation. And so external validation is one of the big reasons to get a pen test. One of the other things I like to talk about when we start talking about security is, anybody have a good definition of security? Okay.
Control. If you want one word, it's control. Control of your resources, who can access them, what they can do with them, and having auditing to back up that you know you control their effectively.
So that was a number of different constraints and that sort of thing in order to make sure that you have control over an environment, right? Security is an emotion. Security is how you feel. Right now, we feel pretty secure. Dude walks in with a gun. That changes pretty rapidly. The way that people make decisions on security is completely emotional. A lot of the times things are backed up by numbers, but it's how you feel about those numbers for the most part, especially when you start looking at top-level executives. And we can see this a lot in our government. Every time something big happens, new laws come out regarding cybersecurity. They may not necessarily be the most informed, but they're an emotional response to something that's going on right now. And so there's a lot of emotion to security in general. And so demonstrating impact, when somebody can see something, it makes a bigger impact for them to be able to be willing to invest what it takes to get that. Settling political wars between factions is kind of interesting. A lot of the times there's a lot of disagreement between security teams and other people as to what needs to happen. So that sort of thing. And then establishing a baseline for security posture is also important because unless you have some base level of posture, a lot of the other stuff we're going to be talking about next isn't really going to matter. If you can't actually see into your infrastructure and have enough security to be able to detect problems, then you're not going to make it very far as incident response in general. So we've covered some of the reasons why people don't want pen tests, but let's focus specifically on pen testing and incident response. And so obviously our goal is to win, right? Our goal is to make sure that we are creating the most secure organization that we can, and that is both as far as the control side that you mentioned, making sure that the things are there to help you feel secure, and for the executives to be able to sleep at night, the security guys to sleep at night. And you know, one of the things that you hear people asking a lot more now is, what is it that you're worried about? Not, you know, where are your gaps, but what is it that you're worried about? And so we want to win. And one of the great things that security, that pen testers are good at is sort of changing the paradigm. And so what we want to do is we want to change how people are looking at this problem and really start using pen testing as a multi-tool. Not just going in and finding individual problems inside an organization, but working towards actually making the organization better as a whole, and looking at not just pen testing the individual systems, but actually pen testing processes, procedures, and everything else along the way. So some of the other areas that I think that this is the ability to help with, obviously product certification, making sure that as you're rolling out product, not necessarily like, this has Ryan's stamp of approval, but making sure that you're actually following best practices, those sort of things, so that you can say your product has gone through the amount of rigor that you want it to before it's released to the public. Review of architecture changes. More and more organizations are having to rapidly change. Being able to validate those before they go to production is great. Threat modeling is a big one. If you don't know what you have and how it's vulnerable, how do you know how to protect it? And then things like strategic prioritization. Going back to, you know, why do people have the same findings every year? Strategic prioritization is how you determine what projects need to be higher or lower in that priority list in order to make sure that the right things are happening to have the biggest jumps in your security posture. And due diligence is really big right now. People I probably know that you can get breach insurance these days, right? So if you don't follow due diligence, that is very little good. So you need to be able to prove due diligence in order to be able to make sure that that actually matters. One of the other ones that has been popping up a lot more is a lot of the people are changing within information security rules. And so if you land in a new position, maybe as CISO of a new organization, how do you know where you really stand as far as your organization? Pen testing can come on and help you identify what your current posture is so that you know what you need to be working on, especially if it's something that hasn't been tested in a while. And the other one, another one is MSS. So managed security service providers, people who are managing your SIM and your IDS and all of these things, more and more common. And if you're not actually seeing whether or not they can see what they need to see, then that's sort of a scary place to be. And we're going to talk about that some more in a minute. And then also pre-acquisition testing, and then governance in general. So let's get into the incident response part of this. And I think that one of the important things about this process is really, I think it's told best in stories. Penetration testing is an area where we really have to, I think, help connect with people, because just at face value, coming in and breaking things and then giving a report, while we think it's super sexy, business, they don't understand where it fits in, right? So we have to start talking about some of the things that really matter. Like, how confident are you that your controls are working as promised? You have all of these things in place. When was the last time you actually tested them? And when you tested them, best case scenario, they all worked as 100%. How many of the people in your organization were actually able to tell what any of those alerts meant? So one of the things that we see a whole lot when we come in for incident response is something bad's happened and people have absolutely no idea what's going on. So we get on site, there's no logs. The logs maybe have been rolled over and they have the last like 8 hours of logs, because yep, they're logging, that's been checkboxed, but you know, unless it happened in the last 8 hours, they're not gonna have any idea. And then also not logging the right things. If you have no idea what you should be looking for, you have no idea what you should be dealing with, how do you know that you're logging the right things? So what controls am I missing? It's easy to go, okay, I've got the main checkboxes here. I've got my firewall, I've got my IDS, I've got my IPS. What are we missing? And so this reminds me, this is great segregation between the two environments, right? A lot of the pen tests that we do, we notice that people have not thought as much about segregation. There is one segregating line, and that is inside and outside. And with very little control inside, it makes it very easy for us to move around. And one of the biggest problems with security today is it's not a matter of when you're going to get hacked or if you're going to get hacked. It's you're going to get hacked. How quickly can you detect it? And how quickly can you respond to it? And with those things, without sufficient segregation, how do you know where somebody's moving? How do you know how they're moving around your organization? And can anybody access everything? After working in a university, pretty much yes, everybody can access everything. But hopefully we don't want all of our organizations to be quite that open. And so looking at what's important, how to segregate it efficiently while still enabling business to do what it does. That is another problem that we see quite a bit. Not allowing, or not considering the business requirements of what we do when we start making recommendations. Obviously we can secure everything, but if you can't do work anymore, then we're not gonna be doing this for very long. So when somebody does attack, how well can you actually detect it? We've seen this a couple of different places recently, but the defenders who are monitoring things often are pretty inundated with data. So figuring out what's important and what's not is kind of tough. So how can we deal with this? One of the things that we can do is we can actually run real tests against an organization. And we can actually see what these things look like. So when this is happening, can you actually map attacks to log entries? Can you actually map the types of exfiltration that someone's doing to the actual log data that you have? And are the events that are firing coinciding with this? Because if you're not actually seeing the types of logs that you need to be able to detect an attack, you're pretty much game over, right? So by actually sitting side by side with your pen tester, looking at what's happening, looking at the logs you're getting, you can get a couple of different things out of it. One, you learn a little bit more about how attacks are done. So from a defender standpoint, one of the things that defenders, I think, generally are lacking is understanding of how and why attacks work the way that they do. Lots of people, especially in forensics, they see attacks all the time, they see the results of the attacks, but sometimes the nuances are missed because why did somebody do this instead of this? Why did somebody go with the blind SQL injection here instead of an error message based SQL injection? And sometimes it's those little things that make all of the difference. And so being able to sit side by side with the tester and actually go through that process and get that information is infinitely more valuable than just having a pen tester come in, run a test, give a report, and then have the people go back and try to sort out their logs and see what they saw. And sort of another interesting piece here is, can you detect the bad things? And so even if you can pick out what's important, you may not really have a good idea of how all the things are related. And so that's sort of, this goes back to sitting down with your pen tester for doing some of this stuff. Figuring out what's noise in your environment, figuring out what is legitimate activity is kind of interesting. For instance, how many people inside an organization use PSExec for some sort of system administration tasks? How do you tell the difference between when one of your sysadmins is using PSExec legitimately and when a hacker is using PSExec maliciously? What's your baseline for this activity? Where do these things come from? Can you detect when somebody's using it from somewhere that it's not supposed to? One of the things that I see pretty commonly is people are like, well, that was Bob, we're just going to whitelist this event. So at that point, that event will never show back up again. And so the biggest problem with SIMs is they're really noisy. They tell you all the things that are going on. So you just go ahead and mute all that stuff that's going on, and then everything is smooth sailing from there, right? No more alerts, we're good to go. And so we want to make sure that we're alerting on the right things and that we're not alerting on the wrong things. So being able to detect that good versus bad is important. So another one, do people actually know what they're supposed to be looking for? And one of the funniest things that I see all the time is we go in, we do with full knowledge, here's our IP addresses, here's where we're coming from, all of this other stuff, and we say, can you detect any of the stuff that's happened? And they're like, well, we'll check into that. And then like 3 weeks later, I'll get a phone call, and it'll say, please tell me you're still pen testing us, right? Because something else has happened inside the organization. They can't tell what's going on because they don't have sufficient logging. It didn't come from my IP address, they don't think, but hopefully you're still pen testing us, right? And so not being able to see the good and making sure that you can actually see what the pen testers are doing the entire time, being able to also be able to differentiate that from what's going on outside of that is super important. The other thing is pen testing isn't necessarily always the same thing that you're going to get when an actual malicious person comes in. One of the things that we recommend is actually going through a threat modeling exercise in order to identify what your primary threat actors are likely going to be and try to emulate some of that behavior. Because they come in and run same set of tools that somebody runs for everybody else, vuln scanners, that sort of thing. It certainly detects certain types of things, but it's not going to give you the same sort of alerts that you would get if somebody was actually, for instance, installing remote access Trojans into your environment and exfiltrating data. Those sort of things you don't necessarily always see. We were doing a pen test, and during the closeout call, the MSSP called and said, on Monday we saw activity. We think it was bad. So this was during the outbrief. We were telling the client exactly what we were doing. The MSSP had taken a couple days in order to actually alert them of what was going on. But they weren't sure if it was good or bad activity, so it was being left to somebody else. And it was 5 days old. So how much stuff can happen in 5 days, right? So another one is not just does your staff know what they're looking for, but whoever you have monitoring your tools, do they have the ability to not just detect what's bad and what's not, but also act on it in a reasonable amount of time. Which kind of goes to this point. Can you rely on your staff to follow the processes, right? And so there's two places here where I wanted to sort of tell some additional stories. One of them was I was on site doing a pen test, and I was on one side of a cubicle wall, and the sysadmins were on the other side of a cubicle wall. I compromised the domain controller and created a new account to see if they'd pick it up. Sure enough, after about 20 minutes, they picked it up, and the person whose account it was at a doctor's appointment that I'd used to actually create the new domain admin. So what I listened to for the next hour was them discussing how somebody created a domain admin account from the doctor's office. And then when the person came back, they thought that maybe it was good to implement the incident response plan. So then from that point, they discussed for another hour and a half whether or not they had an incident response plan and who they needed to tell. So obviously this is something that hadn't been practiced very well. When to implement it, how to implement it, who to tell, all of that process wasn't actually sort of ingrained. And so if you're not actually testing to see if people are following this plan, how well is it actually going to work? If these guys didn't know if they had one, what's the chance when it actually is implemented and the incident response process started that all the right people would be called in, that all of the different areas that need to be involved would be involved? And then there's sort of the other side of this where on another test I was doing, I was co-teaming with someone else, and one of the sysadmins, we sort of knew it was going to be bad when we walked in, and during the initial briefing, suddenly the sysadmin's views on their security posture changed. They had told security everything was awesome, and then suddenly, well, maybe there are a couple gaps here, and we don't think they'll find anything. And then as the discussion continued, it got worse and worse. Well, so the sysadmins decided that the best course of action during this pen test was to watch what we were doing. So they had put port monitors where we were so that they could see everything we did, and then that way they would know as soon as we got into a system, and then they could fix it right then. And then that would not be a problem. They were gonna, get through this stunningly. So as we start working through systems, we capture one of the sysadmin's accounts and start using it. It happened to be the sysadmin that was watching us through this process. So what happened next was a series of temper tantrums, including some actual honest-to-God tears. And to make sure that we could get no further, he went and rebooted the domain controller, because that was the best thing to do to keep us off of the domain controller. So as he kept changing his password, we kept getting it back and using it again. And so instead of implementing the incident response process, he bounced the DC. So obviously, maybe at least he was responding, I guess, but not having a standard incident response policy in order to be able to work through this means that you have no idea what the actual impact to your organization is going to be. It could be bounce the DC, and who knows what happens after that, right? And so making sure that your people know what processes to follow and know what they need to be doing is really important. So we're going to go over this point, sort of where I think that this should be headed, and then hopefully you guys will have some additional discussion. So for the most part, nobody does remember the things that you did well. They only remember where you failed. And we see this all the time with the stuff that's in the news. Right now, the things that are in the news are not because somebody got breached, but it's all about how they're handling these breaches. And so when you see things like, oh yeah, a vendor presentation showed that we've been compromised for almost 2 years, things like that aren't very good stories for the news. Being able to come in and actually be asking the right questions about things like, do I have sufficient controls? Can I actually detect when people are moving from place to place? What do I have as far as the ability to detect normal activity versus malicious activity. So it's not just necessarily the controls, but how well those controls are tuned. People are another important piece. So how many people here are part of incident response teams? Okay. How many people here are pen testers? How many people here are awake? Yay! Okay. It is early. Thanks for coming out, by the way. I didn't mention that. It really is early. And so making sure that not just the controls are able to detect the right things, but the people know how to interpret them. And one of the biggest gaps, I think, in security right now is the people gap. People are interested, especially for blue team, unfortunately, not looking at hiring the people that have the most experience and they're the best, but there's a big push just to finding people. And more people does not necessarily mean that you'll detect more things. It just means that you have more people that need more training. And so making sure that you have the right people in the right places with the right training. And I think this one's always sort of a stickler, but I think the right experiences too. A lot of the people who are coming out of security programs right now, when you hire an entry-level security person, a lot of the times they're missing that experience. And while they may have a degree, sometimes when you have somebody who's actually come through, I've been a sysadmin, I've been this, I've been that, they've seen enough different things that they know how the world is supposed to work, so you get sort of a different experience out of those people. So just having a CISSP or just having a degree in computer security, well, yeah, CISSP is, you're not drinking. I was hoping you'd be drinking. So all of that stuff is certainly beneficial, but making sure that you have the right people in the right places is one of the most important pieces. So and then process. So when we start talking about pen testing and incident response, we have a couple different things that we do. The first one is we work on helping people build up their security posture so you can see the right things, right? If you can't see the right things, then you're kind of screwed. So what we start off doing is things like threat modeling so that people can figure out what they have, why it matters, who might be interested in it. And then we start looking at what the controls are around that, and we start testing those controls. And if there's insufficient controls, the controls aren't working as we expect them to, those sort of things. Then we look to see whether or not people can actually determine what's going on. And so that's where we start actually sitting with the people who are looking at these and doing the training that they need to be able to detect when problems are happening. And so obviously, this one's sort of tough. It can't just go in with pen testers and say, oh, we hacked some stuff, you should have seen some logs, right? So having the right people with the right training to help with this is important. So this is one of the places where I actually recommend experienced incident responders work with the pen testers in training the people who need to be doing this monitoring to be able to see the things they need to see. But also the incident responders are going to know exactly what logs they need to be able to pull this off. And then also establishing baselines of malicious activity. A lot of the tools out there will learn, right? Well, if you're already completely compromised, learning doesn't really help you very much, right? So being able to identify exactly what is good and what is bad inside the organization, I think is super important. And being able to figure out exactly what people need to be looking for so that they are making the right alerts quiet and not the wrong alerts quiet. False positives are super annoying. False negatives are the ones that put you in the news, right? So we want to make sure that the number of false negatives are limited. And like I said, we've seen this a lot of the time recently where, a large store retailer that was breached actually saw the alerts and they just didn't know what to do with them. And so it turned out that was all of their cash registers being compromised. And so obviously not a great news story. And then when you start talking about due diligence, if your people can't actually detect bad information or bad activity from the information that you have you really done sufficient due diligence? And I think that as more and more lawsuits start popping up around this and people start getting denied more for their breach insurance, that this is going to become much more of a big deal. Another area where this is becoming a big deal is the SEC. SEC has decided that they are going to start prosecuting C-level executives that were negligent in information security practices. So if they knew that there were problems and didn't do anything about it, and it led to information disclosure about people, then they can now go after C-level executives, and they can do everything from finding you to stopping you from being a C-level executive or a board member from a company again. And so this is something that they are more actively pursuing. And obviously with the government right now, there's a couple places where they're pursuing it, but it's not a fast process. So there's not a whole lot of case evidence to go, based on this, and this is what you should be worried about. But this is something that's coming, and they're serious about actually following up more on. And so the other one is making sure that you're actually communicating with your consultants. So regardless of who you get to do your pen test and who you're working with, make sure that you have the business discussion about what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of the pen tests that I see out there, somebody is like, well, I've got this many web servers, I've got this many file servers, I've got this many this kind of servers. We want a pen test. Oh, why? Why do you want a pen test? And so asking that why question so that you can help support the business objectives of the organization is probably the most important thing that we do. Because if we're not supporting these business objectives and we're not telling the right stories, then we're not getting to the right people. And especially when you start talking about doing things like making sure that people's processes and those sort of things are working correctly, that story is extremely important. Because that's one of the things that people worry the most about, is if I've invested all this money, how do I know that it's helping me at all? And this is a great story to be able to tell. We can come in, we can test all this stuff, we can make sure that your people are seeing the right things, we make sure everything's working correctly so that you don't have to wonder, you can actually know, right? So those are the main things I wanted to talk about today. Hopefully I was hoping you guys could have some additional discussion as well. So here's my contact info. Anybody have questions, comments, critiques? Yes, sir.
Take them.
I was talking with a consultant a couple of weeks ago, and they had mentioned there was a healthcare company that basically on their cyber liability insurance, when they had filled out their application, they basically weren't completely honest, and they had a breach. And obviously they, went to their cyber liability carrier, and after they did their review of the incident, they actually went back, and the cyber liability carrier was actually suing the organization because they found that they were actually.
Are you involved in that one?
No.
Oh, you mean cottage healthcare?
Is that what it was? Okay, yeah, they didn't give me a name. Because I
I
think.
just want to make sure you were involved for it.
No.
Cottage healthcare.
Okay.
Well, and that due diligence is a big thing right now. One of the, a lot of places that allow self-attestation that you're doing all of the right things, it's kind of interesting because even if you are being as truthful as you think you are and you don't actually know what your state is, you may be misleading enough that they'll reject that. So making sure that you have all of your stuff on point, you can prove due diligence, you can do all these things before you actually go out and get the cyber insurance for breaches is something that's really important. And one of the things that I hope to see more from the insurance providers is actually doing some requirements for that, so that if they are insuring people, that there's at least a set understanding of what's there. Because right now with the general quality of the pen test being all over the board, if you go and get Joe Bob's pen test and they're like, yep, everything's green, then are you really still doing diligence? If somebody else comes in who is actually somebody who's skilled and finds tons of stuff, which is right. You may have thought that you were doing the right thing by getting Joe Bob's pen test when actually you were really far off. So it's something that is an area that's kind of uncharted right now, but I think it's going to become more important in the future. Anybody else? But good question. Cool. Well, it's 9:45. Okay.
I'll get the mic. Thank you for our microphone. So yeah, the sound guide has a question. So let's step back. I think organizations that are publicly traded that the SEC can go after or have enforced their rules go down a level. Private organization, lots of cloud-based services that, they're a startup, they're getting some traction, but they haven't quite grown up yet. How do you get an organization like that to actually have the tools to even have the logs? It's so easy to have 100 Amazon instances, but no one is doing a login server. So if you tell them, go buy this enterprise tool, they're going to say, no. So where do you steer that group of people to when there is no sysadmin other than maybe the developers or some freelancer they might find if they have a problem?
So that's a good question. And well, and there are people that obviously, like Josh, that help people with that exact issue. But at the end of the day, it's what's important to people, right? Security is not important to you. It probably will be at some point. And most of the time, you hope for people that that's not when they're in the middle of a crisis, right? And so, especially with startups, what's important right now is getting a product and making money, and then figuring out the security stuff later, because they don't realize that when you actually have to go back and try to figure out how to bake in security later, that they're basically screwed, right? I mean, when you start talking about having to add security to something that's inherently insecure, you've got all sorts of problems. And the other piece of that is not having the right people, because if you've got the right people, then those right people are actually, when they're DevOpsing everything, making sure that they have all of the different logs that they need. They have them at least in a central repository, and it's not hard to get tools that will help you deal with some of that. I mean, everything from Bro is free for IDS. There's lots of different free things that people can use in order to do some of this. OSM, those sort of things. All of it is possible. It's just having the right people with the right understanding to do the right things. And I think it's completely a priority issue. Small people don't think about security because that's not what they do. And until something happens, it's not an issue. So I think that the other piece of that is making sure that people understand why they're at risk and that sort of thing, so that it can be something that they're at least thinking about. A lot of people feel like they're too small for attackers to be interested in. But when we're doing incident response, the people who are most negatively affected by a breach are the mom and pop shops. When we come in and do incident response, $500 an hour, the amount of money that a mom and pop shop or a startup can take with $500 an hour of investigations is really small. And so a lot of these people that we see that either have to choose never to accept credit cards again or to go under. And it's sort of just a bad sort of deal. So I think we need to do a better job as a security industry of making sure that people understand there is no too small to get hacked. But good question. Anybody else? Cool. Thank you guys very much.